This is Duke University.
Our third speaker is Timea Junghaus, president of the European Roma Cultural Foundation. She is an art historian, contemporary art curator of Roma Sinti origin, and Romani cultural activist. She has published prolifically on European Roma visual art and has curated many exhibitions of Roma culture, for which she has won several prizes. The title of her talk is Roma Contemporary Art, the Epistemic Disobedience.
Thank you. Can you see the presentation if I'm sitting here? All right. So, thank you for the invitation and congratulations for the event. It's a historic moment. My presentation title is Roma Contemporary Art, the Epistemic Disobedience. And I'm working from the same pool of authors that Carol does, so I already cut the text a bit and cut to the second chapter, which is as a result of, and I have to switch the slides, so as a result of the research into the Roma image in the history of art, we can conclude that the imaginarium which condenses Roma into the iconography of the stranger, pagan, alien, thief, evil, and ugly, already developed in the 15th and 16th century. And the visual systems or scopic regimes of the later centuries continue to reproduce the subordinate position of Roma in European societies, or in other words, the Roma subaltern. Moreover, as our brilliant sociologist colleague Eva Kovács summed up, what we find when studying the art of the 19th century is that in the Central European panoptic regime of modernity, here I quote, Roma became dependent of Western Europe's African and Asian primitives. Examining the archaeology of these images, we can demonstrate how Central European societies created their own black through wild groups and individuals, and primarily through their own local Roma colonies. We may also see how the Roma body is sexualized and feminized, similarly to the black body in European modernity. European visual production forced Roma into the conceptual ghetto of the gypsy outcast. The Roma subalternity, as the excellent study of Angela Koczi and Edith Trehan of 2013 says, the burden of being the other and the physical, symbolic, epistemic violence, in other words, the colonial act of European majorities towards the Roma, is the most visible and evident in the sphere of the visual. Thus, exploring the desires of the Roma subaltern is the field naturally preferred by the Roma cultural theorists, even though the scientific discourse in Central Europe questions the existence of a Central European colonized minority and argues that Central and Eastern Europe, where the majority of the Roma minority lives, is structurally and historically different from the West. In the second part of the 20th century, creative Roma writers, artists, and film directors making self-representations were finally allowed into the mainstream discourse. After the first World Romani Congress in 1971, Romani visual artists started to claim recognition as a group. Before the 1970s, Roma images were, for centuries, created exclusively by the non-Roma. And Roma creative production was represented as not being the work of individual authors, but rather as collective facts of nature, which only become a concrete representation when they were in some way presented by an art collector or folklorist. Since the first Romani Congress, hundreds of exhibitions, performances, artworks, conferences, and so on, construct a long hidden and unknown genealogy. Building the chronology of these cultural events, we may tell the story, or more courageously say, the history of Roma art. Due to the time constraints, we will not have time to review this history, but perhaps I shall mention a few of the most important historical moments, such as the discovery of János Balázs, the first Roma painter in Europe in 1968, the first Roma art exhibition in 1979, curated by activist Agnes Daróczi, The first Roma, Gypsy, and Traveler art exhibition organized in the United Kingdom by Professor Thomas Acton, the Roma Pavilion in the Venice Contemporary Art Biennale, the establishment of the Museum of Romani Culture in Brno in the Czech Republic, or the first commercial gallery specializing in Roma art at the Kai Dikas Gallery in Berlin. In this sense, the notion of Roma art is built from our most precious moments of celebrating Roma creativity in the Roma cultural movement of the past 4 decades. Roma creative practices aim to make a positive intervention into the Roma representation and an attempt for transforming the Roma image. Roma art seeks specific practices to reconfigure diasporic gazes into subjects and to invite ourselves to be viewers, to uncover the colonial discourse inscribed in us, and to depict it in exhibitions so that it is quasi-disenchanted in order to unmask the Western master discourse as a historical legend. Jacques Lacan states in the psychoanalytic context that the subject loses to some extent its autonomy when she recognizes that she is the observed object, the subject of the not localizable impersonal gaze, regard, which is projected onto her by the elusive other, or autre. In 1975, during the second wave of feminist theory, Laura Mulvey, in her study entitled Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, described the notion of the male gaze as a specific mechanism for sustaining the asymmetric power relations and the objectification of women. Based on this concept, the idea of a female gaze in the theories of several feminist theoreticians appears. A Roma diaspora gaze, the gaze of the Roma diaspora, is conceivable on the basis of the same logic. The legitimacy of Roma visual production is also affirmed by the need for Roma images in the fight against anti-Roma visual propaganda. The increasing number of paramilitary organizations, racist and neo-Nazi groups and nationalist formations in Europe are using visual propaganda in their campaigns for increasing and disseminating anti-Roma hatred and violence. The images used in these web advertisements, billboards, campaigns, flyers, newspapers, advertisements, and political campaigns degrading Roma are all the agents of ideological manipulation which harm people. They operate in the same way as pornographic images, which are, according to Catherine McKinnon, not simply the presentations of violent act, but the act itself, the act of violent degradation. These websites and visual forces include new creatives to humiliate and objectify us, the Roma. They consciously distort and manipulate Roma subjects until it is expedient for the eliciting of maximum disgust. This practice could be easily demonstrated by the election billboard of the Slovakian SNS party. The Roma model of the billboard photo was not informed that he will be darkened, fattened, decorated with jewels, and tattooed. The text reads, "Let's not feed those who do not want to work." Julia Kristeva's theories describe that the object is what society marks as filth, dirt, which distracts the order imagined or constructed by society, which subverts the identity, the structure, the system, which does not respect borders or rules. Kristeva's metaphor about the skim of the milk, which she is morbidly disgusted by, perfectly illustrates the idea of the object. We need to understand the operation of these oppressive pictures, not just to learn why to appreciate the work of Roma artists and creative talents, but also to recognize the pervasive and still hidden mechanisms of their strategies. When Frantz Fanon writes about negritude, he uses the term corporeal malediction to describe the phenomenon articulated in the moment of visual encounter, which he refers to as, in quotes, "look, a Negro." In the Central European panoptic regime, the Roma became the pundits of Fanon's, in quote, Negro. The Italian billboard, Donna Italia has been massacred by the Roma, has been adopted by the Hungarian far-right forces in 2012 and 2013, just like the European campaign of Romania, which explained the EU officials and citizens with the connecting educational DVD, the difference between the good Romanian families and the bad Roma families, by claiming the restating of the gypsy adjective to describe the Roma to avoid confusions in Europe. In this oppressive, racist, and fearful environment, there is an even more important demand for Roma art, which deconstructs the traditional Roma image established by the hegemonic and powerful white majority. The Roma artists are looking for analytic and practical options, confronting and delinking from the colonial matrix of power, and this is how they arrive to the movement of decoloniality. The colonial matrix of power produced social discrimination, eventually codified as racial, ethnic, anthropological, or national, according to specific historic, social, and geographic contexts. This Roma decolonial thinking and doing is both a political and epistemic project. Decoloniality has been called a form of epistemic disobedience, epistemic delinking. Roma women artists demonstrate how to delink, how to unlearn the Western Eurocentric discourse. The artistic careers of Omara, Kiba Lumberg, Selma Selman, Delaine LeBas demonstrate the operation of structural oppression towards the Roma and offer new models on how to revolt against this oppression and how to reject the majority's dominance in order to construct new Roma women identities. They appear in contemporary art, in the contemporary art canon in brackets, as an outsider, and still they are integral part of the artistic, political, and academic system. They appear as incoherence, threat, or a dangerous element hindering its systematic operation. Roma contemporary art is organized around the question of visibility, on how the Roma artist can rewrite or modify the mainstream discourse once she has arrived in the position of visibility. In this sense, they apply feminist strategies. When it comes to defining the interests of the Roma minority, they do not rely exclusively on visual art. They operate with actions, fits, scandals, demonstrations, and political statements using printed, electronic, broadcasted media to disseminate their opinion. For example, when Omara met the millionaire George Soros, the prime funder of the first Roma pavilion at the Venice Contemporary Art Biennale, she took out her glass eye, placed it in Mr. Soros' hands, and said, "Thank you for your support. I wish I could return your generosity. This is the most valuable thing I have." This artistic action is perhaps the most efficient description of the complex situation of Roma cultural and general project funding in Europe. The works that operate with the power of humor are not simply spontaneous games or theatric self-exhibitions, but ritual performances, which are formed under the pressure and influence of oppression, deploying the power of taboo and fleeing from the horror of exclusion. They use the subversive power of parody, the way Judith Butler suggests. They reject and change the laws in order to use them against those who created them. In Delaine LeBas' installations, for example, the representations of the white man work the same way in her ethnographic collection about the non-Roma as the innumerable incarnations of the gypsy in the European tradition of photography and visual arts. The contemporary art reflections on the memory of the Roma Holocaust are always in search of the possibility of reconciliation between Roma subjectivity and Gajo reality. Gajo is the Roma term for non-Roma. I brought an example from the Czech Roma and Jewish artist Tamara Moises, whose performative action entitled Roma Holocaust Memorial took place at the field of the former Jew and Gypsy collection campsite in Prague in the 7th district. Her protest against the building of a Tesco supermarket on this historical location was successful, and today a memorial serves the memory of the victims. On how to induce constructive shame, we turn to Paul Gilroy. Gilroy, in his groundbreaking book entitled Postcolonial Melancholia, while he tries to differentiate between inherited guilt and constructive shame, he writes about the need, I quote, to transform paralyzing guilt into a more productive shame that would be conducive to the building of a multicultural nationality that is no longer phobic about the prospect of exposure to either strangers or otherness. I'm done. The argument for the legitimacy and support of Roma artistic production based on Roma culture right is very often disregarded. I cut the text. For example, between 1979 and 2004, over 8,000 artworks were bought by 10 state collections, and there still is not a single permanent exhibition in Europe. I also talk about the lack of institutions, and I refer to a place which seems to be the most innovative place of Roma Contemporary Art at the moment, which is actually in the 8th District Ghetto of Budapest, and it is a former vegetable stand. To conclude my presentation, the notion of Roma art may sound of essentialist or strategic essentialist prominence, but it is a term of multiple ambitions. Number one, it aims for a productive intervention in the description and presentation of Roma. It celebrates Roma creativity and the precious moments of Roma cultural movement. It produces a counter-visual against anti-Gypsyism and neo-fascism. And number four, we do not need to argue because the legitimacy of Roma art is basically the recognition and fulfillment of Roma cultural rights. The Roma cultural movement and its central notion, Roma Contemporary Art, has been the most efficient vehicle in the past 4 decades for the exploration of Roma subjectivities. Bell Hook's African-American feminist critic claims, opposition is not enough. In the vacant moment after one has resisted, there is the necessity to become, to make oneself anew. And in this hard labor over making ourselves anew, Roma art has the most vital and defining role. The Roma cultural context offers creative and critical practices for the Roma minority, through which our widely dispersed and fragmented Roma minorities can transcend national boundaries, creating a mutually accessible, translatable, and inspirational political culture that invites universal participation.
Thank you so much, Timea Junghaus, for a fascinating presentation.